The ground didn't just meet her. It swallowed her whole. One moment Evelyn was walking. The next, the vast, unforgiving prairie rose up and slapped the breath from her lungs. She twisted, a mother's final, desperate instinct, shielding the precious bundle in her arms. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot through her ribs, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the child. The world spun, a dizzying carousel of baked earth and endless blue sky, before flickering into blackness. Her last conscious thought wasn't of herself, but of the tiny whimper that had just begun. Rosie was crying, and in the deafening silence of the Arizona flatlands, that sound was a gunshot, a signal, a death knell. The cry traveled on the wind, a thin, piercing thread of sound that cut through the rustle of dry grass. Miles away, a man heard it. He sat atop a bay pony, still as the rock formations that dotted the landscape. He was a man carved from the land itself, skin the color of burnished copper, eyes sharp enough to spot a hawk's shadow from a mile away. Tahan, his hand resting on his pony's neck, tightened. The sound snagged something deep in his memory, a ghost of a cry from a long-ago winter, a sickness, a sister's voice fading to nothing. He squeezed his eyes shut, pushing the memory back into the dark place where it lived. But he couldn't ignore the sound. Not this sound. He turned his pony, his movements fluid and silent, and rode toward the cry. He found them in a patch of tall grass, the woman a crumpled heap of dusty blue fabric, the infant squirming and wailing in her unconscious arms. He dismounted, his boots making no sound on the parched earth. He knelt. The baby's face was slick with tears and sweat, her tiny fist pounding the air. The woman was pale, her breathing so shallow it was barely there. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse, faint but alive. He looked at the way she was curled around the child, a protective shell even in oblivion. His own chest felt tight, a knot of old grief and new urgency. He gently pried her arms open, lifting the baby. Rosie's cries faltered, turning to hiccups as she stared up at this strange new face. Tahan looked from the helpless child to the dying woman. He could take the baby, leave the woman to the coyotes and the sun. It would be easier, simpler. No one would ever know. He adjusted the swaddled infant in the crook of his arm, her warmth a startling contrast to the cold calculation in his mind. He took a long look at the woman's face, etched with hardship and fear. Then he turned his back on her, the baby secure in his arms, and began to walk away. He walked 10 paces, 20. The woman didn't stir. The prairie held its breath. It was done. He would save the child and leave the mother to her fate. He kept walking, the soft weight in his arms a strange and terrible comfort. But then he stopped. The memory he'd pushed away came roaring back. His sister, her small hand growing cold in his. He had been a boy then, helpless. He wasn't a boy anymore. A low curse escaped his lips, a harsh sound in the quiet air. He couldn't do it. He couldn't leave another soul to fade away while he stood by. He turned, his jaw set like stone, and strode back to where Evelyn lay. He didn't handle her with gentleness. There was no time. He hoisted her over his shoulder like a sack of grain, her limp body a dead weight. He secured her to the pony with a leather strap, her head lolling with every step. He then swung up behind her, cradling Rosie against his chest. He looked at the vast empty horizon. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted this. But fate, or something like it, had thrown this broken woman and her child into his path. And Tahan knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this single act was about to shatter the solitary peace he had fought so hard to build. Their journey to his shelter was a blur of dust and fading light. Evelyn drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the rhythmic sway of the horse and the solid warmth of the man's body behind her. She was too weak to question, too broken to fear. When they finally stopped, she felt herself being lifted down, carried into a space that smelled of cool stone and old smoke. He laid her on a bed of dry grass and soft furs. The darkness was complete for a time, and then a spark, a flame, a small fire crackled to life, pushing back the shadows. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open. She saw the rough stone walls of a shallow cave, and she saw him. He was sitting across the fire, feeding it small twigs, his expression unreadable. And beside him, swaddled and sleeping, was Rosie. A wave of relief so powerful it left her breathless washed over Evelyn. Her baby was safe. But then her eyes caught something else. Something that made the blood freeze in her veins. Hanging from a leather cord on his belt was a small, silver locket. It was tarnished and dented, but she would have recognized it anywhere. It was the locket her husband, Graham, had given her on their wedding day. Inside were tiny portraits of her parents. She had thought it lost forever, dropped in the chaos when the wagon was attacked, when he was taken from her. How did this man have it? The question screamed in her mind, a silent, frantic shriek. She pushed herself up, her voice a raw croak. The locket! He didn't look up from the fire, but she knew he heard her. Where did you get that? He remained silent, his focus entirely on the flames. The firelight danced across his sharp cheekbones, making him look like a spirit of the earth, ancient and unknowable. Tell me, she rasped, desperation giving her strength. She crawled forward a few inches, her body screaming in protest. Please! Tahan finally lifted his head. His eyes, dark and deep, met hers. There was no pity in them, only a heavy, weary truth. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached for the locket, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he unfastened it from his belt. He held it out to her across the small fire. His hand was steady, his gaze unwavering. Evelyn's hand trembled as she took it. The cool metal felt like a ghost against her skin. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers clumsy and weak. It sprang open, but it wasn't her parents' faces that stared back at her. It was a single faded portrait of Graham, and tucked behind it, a tiny folded piece of paper. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't her locket. It was Graham's, the one he always wore, hidden beneath his shirt. Tahan finally spoke, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. I found it on him. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Graham was dead. She had known it, of course. Deep down, she had accepted it. But hearing it spoken aloud, seeing this final proof, was like a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the firelight. But through her grief, another, colder feeling began to rise. Fear. This man hadn't just found her. He had found her husband. What had happened out there? She looked at Tahan, really looked at him, and saw not a savior, but a specter, a man who had walked out of the same tragedy that had destroyed her life. Who was he? What had he seen? You found him? She whispered, the words barely audible. Tahan gave a slow, deliberate nod. He was not alone. The cave, which had felt like a sanctuary moments before, suddenly felt like a trap. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls, and every shadow seemed to hold a new, unspoken threat. Evelyn clutched the locket so tightly the edges dug into her palm. Not alone? What do you mean? Tahan stared into the fire, his face a mask of stone. It was clear he was choosing his words carefully, as if weighing each one before letting it go. There was another man, he said, his voice flat. A white man, like him. He gestured vaguely toward the locket in her hand. They were arguing. Loud words, angry words. Evelyn's mind raced. Who could Graham have been arguing with? They were traveling with Jonas, his partner, his best friend. But Jonas was family. They trusted him. It couldn't have been him. What did he look like? She pressed, her voice trembling. Clean-shaven, Tahan said. Tall, wore the hat of a soldier. The description hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Jonas. It was Jonas. He had served in the cavalry before heading west. But why would they be fighting? It made no sense. What happened? She asked, dread coiling in her stomach. I was tracking a buck, Tahan continued, his voice never changing its monotone pace. I heard the shouting. I stayed hidden. It is not my place to interfere in the world of white men. His words were a cold splash of water, extinguishing the last embers of hope that he might be a protector. He was an observer, a scavenger. He had watched. They fought, he said. The tall one, he was stronger. He pushed your man. Graham. The name sounded strange and foreign on his lips. He fell. He hit his head on a rock. Tahan paused, his eyes still fixed on the flames. He did not get up. Evelyn felt the world tilt again. Jonas and Graham had fought, and Graham had died. It was an accident, a horrible, tragic accident. That had to be it. The grief was so immense, so suffocating, she could barely breathe. She pictured Jonas, devastated, trying to help his friend. Alone. But Tahan wasn't finished. The tall one, he said, his gaze finally shifting from the fire to her face. He did not try to help him. He waited. He watched him bleed. Evelyn shook her head, a violent, jerky motion. No, no, you're lying. Jonas wouldn't do that. He loved Graham. They were like brothers. Tahan's expression didn't change. He offered no comfort, no reassurance. He just stated what he saw. When it was over, he said, he took the horse. He took the supplies from your husband's pack. And he took the map. Evelyn stared at him, confused. Map? What map? Tahan's eyes narrowed slightly. A map of this land, with marks on it, near the creek beds. It clicked into place with sickening clarity. The claim. Graham and Jonas had spent a year prospecting, searching for gold. They had finally found a promising location. The map was their future, and Jonas had taken it. He hadn't just left his friend to die, he had robbed him. The man who had shared their bread, who had held Rosie when she was born, was a monster. But a more horrifying thought clawed its way into her mind. Tahan had been there. He had seen everything. He had watched her husband die, watched his supposed friend rob the body, and he had done nothing. He had simply waited in the shadows like a vulture. And then what? He had picked over what was left, the locket. And then, days later, he had found her. Was it a coincidence, or was it something more sinister? She looked at the man across the fire, this silent Apache who had saved her life, and she was suddenly, terrifyingly unsure of what he was. Was he a witness, or was he a participant? The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks into the air. The small cave felt like it was shrinking, the air growing thick and heavy. She was alone in the wilderness, her life and her daughter's life, in the hands of a man who had watched her husband die and walked away. The silence stretched on, a taut wire of suspicion and fear. And Evelyn knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that the danger wasn't just out there on the prairie. It was right here, in the cave with her. The next few days were a waking nightmare of suspicion. Evelyn held Rosie close, her body a constant, trembling shield. She watched Tahan's every move, searching for a flicker of malice, a hint of the predator she feared he was. But his actions were maddeningly inconsistent with her fears. He was gentle. He would leave broth for her by the fire, never pressing her to eat. He carved a small, smooth bird out of a piece of pine wood and hung it from the cave ceiling for Rosie to watch. Her baby gurgles the only sound that broke the suffocating tension. He moved with a quiet efficiency, never making a sudden move, as if he understood the fragile, terrified state she was in. This kindness was more unnerving than open hostility would have been. It was a mask. It had to be. No man who watched another die so callously could possess such tenderness. One evening as Rosie slept, Evelyn couldn't bear the silence any longer. "Why?" she asked, her voice tight. "Why didn't you help him?" Tahan was sharpening his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape, 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 the only sound in the cave. He didn't stop. "It was not my fight." "Not your fight," she shot back, her voice rising with a week's worth of pent-up fear and anger. "A man was dying. You just stood there? You let Jonas ride away with everything Graham owned?" The scraping stopped. Tahan set the knife down with deliberate care. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his stone-like expression. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something that looked like old, settled pain. "You think I am a coward?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I think you're a scavenger," she whispered, the ugly word hanging in the air between them. "You waited for them to be gone, and you picked over the bones." He didn't deny it. He simply picked up his knife again. "The world is hard," he said, his voice low. "I have learned to survive." "By letting people die?" she cried, tears of frustration and terror streaming down her face. He finally looked at her fully, and his eyes were black holes of memory. "I have seen what happens when my people interfere with yours," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I have seen my family hung from trees for less. I have seen our women and children shot for sport. I learned a long time ago that the best way to survive a fight between two white men is to not be there at all." The raw, brutal honesty of his words silenced her. The history between their peoples was a bloody, unforgivable chasm. What he saw as cowardly survival, he had been taught was necessary. She saw a man who had watched her husband die. He saw a man who had chosen to live, a choice he had probably been forced to make countless times before. The revelation didn't make her trust him, but it shifted the ground beneath her fear. He wasn't a simple monster. He was something far more complicated, a man shaped by a violence she could barely comprehend. But as she lay awake that night, listening to the sound of his steady breathing across the fire, a new, more terrifying thought emerged. Tahan had told her Jonas had taken the map. He'd said Jonas had left Graham for dead, but Tahan was the one who had the locket. Why would Jonas, a man robbing a corpse, leave something so personal, so valuable behind? It didn't add up, unless Tahan's story wasn't the whole truth. What if he hadn't just been an observer? What if he had confronted Jonas after Graham fell? What if they had fought? What if Tahan had taken the locket from Jonas? Or worse, what if Tahan had gotten there first? The possibilities twisted in her gut, each one darker than the last. She was trapped in a cave with a man whose story had holes big enough to fall through, and the truth was buried somewhere out on that vast, silent prairie, along with her husband's body. Weeks bled into one another. The rhythm of their strange, shared existence became almost normal, a terrifying kind of domesticity built on a foundation of unanswered questions. Tahan showed her which roots were safe to eat, how to read the clouds for rain. Evelyn, in turn, began to mend his worn-out shirts, her stitches small and neat, an echo of a life she no longer recognized. They were two ghosts haunting the same patch of land, bound together by the sleeping child who was the only solid, real thing in their world. Tahan never pushed, never demanded, but his presence was a constant, unnerving weight. He had decided they would move. The rock shelter was too exposed. He knew a place, a hidden basin with a spring, where they could survive the coming winter. Evelyn didn't argue. To argue would be to admit she had a choice, and she knew she didn't. She was utterly dependent on this man, this mystery she both feared and, to her shame, was beginning to rely on. The basin was exactly as he described it, a secret green world cupped in the palm of the dry prairie. Cottonwood trees offered shade, and a clear spring trickled from the rocks. It was a paradise, a beautiful cage. Here life settled into a routine. Mornings were for chores, afternoons were for Rosie, who was now crawling and exploring her new world with a fearless curiosity that tore at Evelyn's heart. Evenings were for the silent space around the fire. One afternoon, Evelyn realized they were almost out of salt and flour. The nearest town, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings called Redemption, was a day's ride away. She had to go. Tahan offered to go for her, but she refused. The thought of being left alone even for a day was unbearable. And besides, she needed to feel solid ground under her feet, to see other faces, to remember that a world existed beyond this basin and the silent man who ruled it. The general store in Redemption smelled of sawdust, leather, and chewing tobacco. It was loud and crowded, and Evelyn felt like a phantom, her prairie-worn dress and haunted eyes setting her apart from the hardy, sun-beaten townspeople. She kept her head down, gathered her supplies, and tried to be invisible. As the shopkeeper, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar, weighed her flour, he made idle chat. "Haven't seen you round here before, ma'am." Evelyn gave a tight, polite smile. "Just passing through." The man grunted. "Funny thing, had another stranger in here just last week, asking after a woman and a child. A widow." Evelyn's blood ran cold, her hand resting on the counter, clenched into a fist. "Said his best friend died out on the prairie, a real tragedy. Said he'd been searching for the man's wife and baby ever since." a real stand-up fellow. What, what was his name? Evelyn asked, her voice a reedy whisper. The shopkeeper squinted, thinking. Jonas, I believe. Tall fella, carried himself like a soldier. A real hero, that one. Told us all about how he tried to save his friend from a savage Apache who attacked their camp. Said the savage killed his friend and ran off. Jonas barely got away with his life. The bag of flour slipped from Evelyn's numb fingers, bursting on the floorboards in a cloud of white dust. The shopkeeper's story was a lie, a complete, twisted lie. But it was a believable lie, a story the people in this town would readily accept. An Apache savage, a heroic friend, a tragic death. Jonas wasn't just a thief who had left his friend to die. He was a cunning, cold-blooded liar who had already painted Tahan as a murderer. And he wasn't just searching for her. He was hunting her. He was rewriting history, and in his version, Tahan was the villain. And she, Evelyn, was the damsel in distress he was coming to rescue. The store suddenly felt suffocating. The air was thick with a lie so potent it was poisoning her. She had to get back. She had to warn him, because Jonas wasn't just coming for her. He was coming for Tahan, and he was bringing the righteous fury of an entire town with him. The ride back to the basin was a frantic, desperate blur. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of an approaching posse. When she finally stumbled into their camp, she found Tahan calmly skinning a rabbit. The sheer normalcy of the scene was jarring. "He's coming!" she gasped, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Jonas! He's in redemption! He told them you killed Graham." Tahan didn't even look up from his work. His hands, slick with blood, moved with the same steady, practiced rhythm as always. "I expected this," he said, his voice calm. "You expected this?" she shrieked, her control finally snapping. "He's telling everyone you're a murderer. They'll come for you. They'll hang you." "Let them come," he said, finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were dark and unreadable. There was no fear in them, only a chilling resolve. This calm in the face of certain death was more terrifying than any panic. It was the calm of a man who had accepted his fate. But Evelyn couldn't accept it, not after everything. She had spent weeks living in fear of this man, but the thought of a mob dragging him away, of him being punished for a crime he didn't commit, a crime he had witnessed, was unbearable. "We have to leave," she said, her voice pleading. "We have to run." "There is nowhere to run," Tahan said simply. "This is my land. I will not be chased from it by the lies of a coward." He went back to his work, the conversation, for him, apparently over. Evelyn stared at his back, a storm of emotions raging inside her. Frustration, fear, and something else. Something she was ashamed to admit. A fierce, protective anger. She had judged him. She had called him a scavenger. But Jonas was the real vulture. And Tahan, for all his silence and secrets, was the one who had kept her and Rosie alive. That night she couldn't sleep. The basin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, its sheltering walls closing in on them. She watched Tahan as he sat by the fire, his back straight, a rifle resting across his knees. He was watching the entrance to the basin, waiting. He wasn't going to run. He was going to fight. And he was going to die. The thought was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. She thought about the locket. She thought about his story. It still didn't make perfect sense. Why had Jonas left the locket? Why had Tahan taken it? The missing pieces gnawed at her. She had to know the truth. All of it, before it was too late. She rose from her bed of furs, Rosie sleeping soundly, and walked to the fire. She sat across from him, the flames dancing between them. "You didn't tell me everything," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "About that day, about Graham and Jonas." Tahan didn't move, his eyes still scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "I told you what you needed to know." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You told me what you thought I could handle. Now I want the rest of it. I want to know why Jonas is so determined to see you dead. I want to know why he left that locket behind. And I want to know what you're not telling me." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. She thought he would ignore her, that he would retreat back into his fortress of silence. But then he sighed, a deep, weary sound. He leaned the rifle against a rock and turned to face her fully. Jonas did not leave the locket, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The blood drained from Evelyn's face. What do you mean? Tahan's eyes were filled with a terrible sadness. When Jonas rode away, I went down to where your husband lay. I did not go to scavenge. I went to see if there was life left in him. He paused, swallowing hard. There was. Just a little. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled sob escaping her lips. Graham had been alive. Alive, and Tahan was there. He couldn't speak, Tahan went on, his voice thick with a memory he had clearly relived 1,000 times. But he knew me. Our peoples. We had a truce in this valley. Before the soldiers came. He knew I was not an enemy. He reached for the locket around his neck. He pressed it into my hand. Tahan looked at his own hand, as if he could still feel the phantom weight of it. He looked past me, in the direction you had gone with the wagon. He couldn't make a sound, but his eyes begged me. Find her. Protect her. Evelyn was openly weeping now, silent tears carving paths through the dust on her cheeks. Graham hadn't died alone. He had died trying to save her. He had entrusted her, and Rosie, to this stranger. So you took it, she whispered. You took the locket as a promise. Tahan nodded. A debt to a dying man. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Tahan wasn't a coward or a scavenger. He was a man bound by honor, a man who had taken on a sacred duty. He had saved her not out of pity, but out of a promise. That's why he had stayed. That's why he wouldn't run. He was here to fulfill his oath, even if it meant his own death. But why the lie? She asked. Why let me believe you just watched? The truth was a heavier burden, he said softly. I did not think you could carry it. He was right. In those first few days, the truth would have shattered her completely. He had protected her, even from the truth itself. The full weight of his sacrifice, of his quiet, unyielding integrity, crashed down on her. He was willing to die to keep a promise made to her husband, and she had been cowering in fear, ready to run. Not anymore. She wiped her tears, a new hard resolve crystallizing in her heart. They will not take you, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Jonas framed you with a lie. We'll fight him with the truth. Tahan looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something like hope softened the harsh lines of his face. The fire burned low, casting long shadows. But for the first time since she'd woken up in this man's cave, Evelyn wasn't afraid of the dark. The real monster had a name, and he was coming, and she would be ready. They didn't have to wait long. The sound came at dawn, the unmistakable clatter of shod horses on stone, echoing through the narrow entrance of the basin. It wasn't just one rider, it was a group, a posse. Jonas had brought the town with him. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, but the cold resolve from the night before held firm. She strapped a sleeping Rosie to her back, the baby's soft warmth a steadying presence. Tahan stood beside her, his rifle in hand, his face as impassive as ever. But this time they stood together. Jonas rode in first, his face set in a look of grim determination. He looked every bit the hero he pretended to be. Behind him were a dozen men from Redemption, their faces a mixture of grim duty and nervous excitement. They held rifles, their eyes scanning the camp, searching for the savage they'd been told about. When Jonas saw Evelyn standing beside Tahan, his mask of concern flickered. A flash of pure fury crossed his face before he smoothed it back into a pained expression. Evelyn! He cried, swinging down from his horse. Thank God, I found you. Are you all right? Did this animal hurt you? He took a step toward her, his arms outstretched. Stay back, Jonas, Evelyn said, her voice cold and clear, ringing through the morning air. The men behind him murmured, confused. Jonas stopped, his smile faltering. Evelyn, honey, I know you're scared. It's over now. I'm here to take you home. This is my home, she said, gesturing to the small camp, the half-finished shelter. And this man, She put a hand on Tahan's arm. Is not your enemy. Jonas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He's poisoned your mind. Evelyn, this is the man who murdered your husband. My friend, I saw it with my own eyes. Did you? Evelyn's voice cut through his like a whip. Did you see him murder Graham? Or did you see Graham fall after you pushed him? A stunned silence fell over the posse. The men looked from Evelyn to Jonas, their certainty wavering. Jonas's face went pale. What nonsense is this? The grief has made you hysterical. No, Jonas. For the first time in a long time, I see with perfect clarity, she said, taking a step forward. I see the man who got my husband into debt. I see the man who fed his insecurities and turned him against me with lies. And I see the man who shoved his own partner, his brother, and left him to die so he could steal a map to a gold claim. Every word was a hammer blow, chipping away at the heroic facade Jonas had built. The men of the posse were shifting uncomfortably, their rifles drooping slightly. This wasn't the simple story of rescue they had signed up for. Jonas's composure finally cracked. His face twisted into an ugly snarl. She's lying. The savage has bewitched her. Seize him, he roared at the men. But they hesitated, their eyes full of doubt. They looked at Evelyn, at the baby on her back, at the quiet dignity of the Apache man beside her. They looked at Jonas, his face contorted with rage, and they saw not a hero, but a bully. She's not lying, came a new voice. All heads turned. An old man had stepped forward from the back of the posse. It was the shopkeeper from Redemption. I didn't think nothing of it at the time, the old man said, his voice trembling slightly. But when Jonas here came into my store, he paid for his supplies with a gold nugget, a big one. All eyes turned to Jonas. Gold fever was a sickness, and its symptoms were well known. Greed, betrayal, murder. Suddenly, Jonas's story about a savage Apache seemed a lot less plausible than a story about a partnership gone sour over a fortune. Jonas saw the tide turning against him. The doubt in the men's eyes was hardening into suspicion. His trap was closing in on him. In a single fluid motion, he drew his revolver and grabbed Evelyn, pulling her in front of him as a human shield. Enough of this, he screamed, his voice high and panicked. I'm taking what's mine. He pressed the cold barrel of the gun to Evelyn's temple. Rosie, startled by the sudden movement and shouting, began to cry. The sound pierced the tense standoff, a sharp, terrified wail. Tahan, who had remained perfectly still throughout the entire exchange, finally moved. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply took one step forward, his eyes locked on Jonas. Let them go, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Or what, savage? Jonas spat, his grip tightening on Evelyn. You'll shoot through her to get to me? No, Tahan said. And then he did something no one expected. He gently set his rifle on the ground. He raised his empty hands, palms forward. This is not my fight, he said, echoing the words he had once said to Evelyn in the cave. But now they had a different meaning. This wasn't a fight of rifles and bullets. It was a fight of truth and lies. And the truth was on their side. The gesture was so unexpected, so disarming, that it caught Jonas completely off guard. His own men were staring at him, their expressions a mixture of disgust and contempt. He had come here as their leader, a hero avenging his friend. Now he was a desperate man, hiding behind a woman and her crying child. His authority was gone. His story was in tatters. And in that moment of hesitation, Evelyn acted. She stomped down hard on Jonas's instep with the heel of her boot. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She slammed her elbow back into his ribs and threw herself forward, stumbling to the ground, curling into a protective ball around Rosie. The posse surged forward. Jonas, enraged and exposed, fired his pistol wildly. The shot went wide, echoing off the basin walls. Before he could fire again, he was buried under a pile of angry townsmen. They wrenched the gun from his hand and hauled him to his feet, his arms pinned behind his back. It was over. The lie had been broken. Jonas, sputtering and cursing, was bound and dragged away, his own posse now his captors. The shopkeeper gave Evelyn a grim, apologetic nod before turning to follow. Soon they were alone again. The basin was quiet, the morning sun filtering through the cottonwood leaves. Evelyn stood on shaky legs, her heart still pounding. Rosie had quieted, her small face buried in her mother's shoulder. Tahan walked over to her. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. His touch was warm, steady. In his eyes she saw a universe of respect, of gratitude. "You were right," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Honest is strong." He gave the faintest hint of a smile, a rare and precious thing. He looked at her, then at the sleeping child on her back, and then at the small, sturdy shelter they had begun to build against the rock wall. "We are strong," he corrected her. Evelyn leaned into his touch, the solid warmth of his hand on her cheek. The ghosts of the past had been faced. The lies had been burned away by the truth. All that was left was this: the quiet basin, the sleeping child, the man who had kept his promise, and the future, stretching out before them, vast and unwritten, like the prairie itself. It was a new beginning, earned with tears and terror, but it was theirs. And for the first time, Evelyn felt truly, deeply, and irrevocably free. The seasons turned, painting the basin in new colors. Winter's quiet white gave way to the vibrant green of spring, which blazed into the golden heat of summer. The small shelter against the rock wall grew, log by log, into a sturdy cabin. It was small, but it was a home, built not just with wood and clay, but with shared work and a quiet, growing trust. Rosie learned to walk, her first wobbly steps taking her from Evelyn's outstretched hands to Tahan's steady knee. Her laughter, clear and bright as the spring water, filled the spaces that had once been heavy with silence. Evelyn planted a garden, her hands once soft and pale, growing calloused and capable. She found a deep, satisfying peace in the simple act of turning soil, of coaxing life from the earth. She was no longer the fragile, broken woman who had collapsed on the prairie. The land had tested her, and in surviving, it had remade her. She and Tahan never spoke of love. The word felt too small, too simple for the complex tapestry they had woven between them. Theirs was a language of actions. It was in the way he would leave a rare wildflower for her on the cabin's small table. It was in the way she would save him the best piece of rabbit stew. It was in the long, comfortable silences they shared by the fire, watching the stars ignite in the vast, dark sky. They were two solitary souls who had found in each other a place to finally rest. One evening, as a warm summer breeze rustled the cottonwood leaves, Evelyn was watching Rosie chase fireflies at the edge of the creek. Tahan came and stood beside her. They watched the child, a tiny, joyous figure darting through the twilight. "A year ago," Evelyn said softly, her voice full of wonder, "I was praying for death on this land. I thought it had taken everything from me." She turned to look at him, his strong profile silhouetted against the fading light. "I was wrong. It gave me everything." Tahan reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough against hers, a comforting, solid presence. Their fingers intertwined, a natural, easy fit. "The land does not give or take," he said, his voice as quiet as the evening itself. "It reveals what is already there. It showed you the strength you always carried." Evelyn's throat grew tight with emotion. She squeezed his hand, her heart overflowing with a gratitude that was too immense for words. She looked at her daughter, her home, the man standing beside her. She had lost a life, but she had found a world that was honest and real and strong, a world where she belonged. The past was a landscape of ghosts and graves, but it was behind them now. Ahead the prairie stretched out, full of promise, and they would walk it together. Thank you so much for sticking with this story until the very end. If you felt that powerful wave of relief and hope for Evelyn, Tahan, and little Rosie, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. It truly helps more than you know. And if you want more stories that dig deep and hit you right in the feels, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was Tahan a hero from the start, or did he grow into one? I can't wait to read your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe and keep listening for those incredible stories hidden all around us.